Welcome back. Hope you had a chance to stretch, meet someone new, check out the Head High book kiosk, which has many titles written by the participants today. Hope you enjoyed the Van Leeuwen ice cream and parlor coffee. As mentioned, my name is Alexandra Hodkowski. I'm a co-founder and the managing director of The World Around, and it is my absolute honor to introduce our next section. Elizabeth Diller and Catherine Ince in conversation with our esteemed executive director and my colleague, Beatrice Galilei. Elizabeth Diller is a co-founding partner of Diller Scofidio Renfro. Alongside co-founder Ricardo Scofidio, Liz's cross-genre work has been distinguished with Time's 100 Most Influential People list and the first MacArthur Foundation Fellowship awarded in the field of architecture. I believe she was also one of the first people that heard about the crazy idea of The World Around. Catherine Ince is chief curator of V&A East, a new two-site museum and collection research center due to open in London's Olympic Park in 2023. Let's welcome Liz, Catherine, and Beatrice to the stage.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. I hope everyone is, got some sugar hits over the break and has been enjoying the day so far. I know it's a lot. We're on the home straight now, and I'm very, very happy to be part of this moderation of this discussion with Liz Diller and Catherine Ince. The format of this conversation is going to be that Catherine, as you probably know, as Alexandra has explained to you, this is an opportunity to look into the kind of live process of a building being designed. The V&A East, as we're about to hear, is something that is just about under construction, I think, just started to go now, and is in the sort of wrangling process of the design, curation, display, and as part of the ethos of The World Around, we really like to try and explore not just what just happened, but also a little bit about the near and the next. So, Catherine, if you could kick us off.
Thank you.
Great.
And thank you, Beatrice, for inviting me today and to be in conversation with Liz. It's a real privilege to be on a panel with such interesting speakers all day. It's been incredibly stimulating and rich sort of food for thought for our own project. So I'm just going to talk you through what has been a very convoluted few years to the point where we're at now, where it's very exciting. We're making a new museum and we're making a collection research center with Liz and the team at Diller and Scofidio. And I'm just going to talk you through very quickly the sort of vision and ambition, what this project is enabling us to do, why the V&A is expanding to a new campus. And then Liz is going to pick up on the design concept and how that's kind of taking shape and how we're working together to create this amazing thing, which you can get a little hint of on the screen right now. So first of all, I should probably not assume that everybody knows the V&A. It's the Victoria and Albert Museum, one of those kind of classic 19th century museums. It's the national collection of design, decorative arts, performance for the UK. We have amazing holdings across furniture, fashion, textiles, architecture, print culture, sculpture, ceramics, glass, on and on, very fine Asian collections, some of which were collected, over a very long period of time through sort of, colonial associations with the East India Company. The holdings of South Asian material culture came into the museum. Others have been built up and continue to be built up. We've got amazing collections from East Asia, from parts of the Islamic world. So it's a really rich, eclectic array of design and creativity, and it's representative of lots of different parts of the world and spans sort of 5,000 years worth of human endeavor. Our objects number about sort of 2.5 million. About 1 million of those are 2D materials. We have an enormous photographic collection, one of the strongest in the world, particularly in early photography. So this question, just before we came out, Beatrice was asking me, what is it with museums wanting to sort of open up the store? And this sort of question of access is always one that you're wrangling with the V&A at South Kensington, the home of the institution in this so-called Albertopolis, this vision of Prince Albert from the 1850s, directly after the Great Exhibition of 1851, was about sort of educating the public, educating designers to compete, to improve manufactures and the design landscape that Bruce Mao was talking about earlier. But we're in a different century now, and we're asking ourselves what it means to be a public institution, be a public institution of our scale, how we can enable access, intellectual, physical, digital. What does that mean for how we want to work with our collections and collaborate with others to open up what we do to different forms of expertise, to this constant sort of inquiry into cultural heritage. And so when we were invited to move into the Olympic Park in around sort of 2013, 14, as part of this sort of long-term legacy plan for the Olympic Games, we thought it was a fantastic opportunity to create new platforms for a kind of contemporary discourse around the way that design shapes the world, and particularly to reach new audiences. So the V&A is in West London, certain demographies at play in that part of the city. Here in the Olympic Park, which was created for the 2012 Olympic Games, problematic sort of development, compulsory purchase orders, but also lots of positive benefits to putting in new infrastructure in this part of the city. This shot is taken looking south, so you can see in just under the title, you've got the River Thames, you've got Canary Wharf. Historically, it's always been probably an area characterized by low-income residential population, lots of light industry. And now the demographies of just the borough in which the Olympic Park sits are quite extraordinary. There is no sort of minority or majority. It's the most ethnically diverse place in the country. It has the youngest population in the UK. And it's changing, and it's fast as urban transformation pushes the city out to the edges. So for us, it was a very interesting context. And for me, particularly, I grew up in this part of the city, so it felt like an extraordinary opportunity that couldn't turn down. So we are, before I take the entire 30 minutes of this presentation, I'll hurry up. I'll spare you the roller coaster journey that we've been on to decide and determine what the V&A is in the Olympic Park. We are building two new buildings, one at what will be called Stratford Waterfront and one in the former broadcasting centre of the Olympic Games, which is now known as Here East. And our ambition here is to really address this opening up of our collections, but not just through making more stuff available, but by generating new platforms for thinking through material culture, equipping people with new tools, opening up the institution to new forms of critical inquiry, so we can really, be relevant, meaningful, and contributing great public benefit to our audiences and our collaborators. And we want to do this through collaboration, through partnership, through this sort of open-ended inquiry and platform for contemporary creative culture, but also for looking through the past to understand the present and think about the future. I've put this image on here because part of the sort of pre-opening program has been about the ways in which we want to develop opportunities to work with new practitioners, and particularly younger collectives who are deciding that establishment institutions like the V&A perhaps aren't where it's at, and they have something to say about that. And this collective called Galdem, who are a group of young women of color who felt, frustrated and enraged by the lack of sort of representation and diversity, particularly in media, started their own online magazine and started their own sort of print journal, and we invited them to, as part of this sort of idea of thinking about what V&A East could be, we invited them to take over the museum at South Ken and then program with us in Stratford to just try and test ideas and to see how we could collaborate and enable partnerships in different ways. part of our two-site project, I'm not going to talk very much about this. We're going to concentrate on what we're doing with Liz today, but the two sites are this collection of institutions right by the Olympic Stadium and Zaha Hadid's Aquatic Centre. Sadler's Wells, a contemporary commissioning dance theatre, is going to open a new mid-scale theatre. The BBC are moving their music production into a new space in the Olympic Park, out of the sort of cherished and loved Maida Vale studios. And then we've got a new campus for London College of Fashion, which has been distributed for many years. So for the first time in their history, we'll bring together research faculties, teaching faculties across design, marketing, curation into one new space. The other side of the park, UCL are opening a new campus. And so part of our project is to look at the academic partnerships that we can forge, the way the collection and the V&A's programs can be used to develop new insight into industry, into material science and preservation. The museum building is next to LCF. You can see there the form that's come together from sort of iterative process working with O'Donnell and Toomey, an Irish practice. We've got collection galleries, a major temporary exhibition space, projects and event space, studios for learning, informal learning activities. And what we're trying to do is put together a new way of looking across the collections of the V&A, tuning our programs and our collection displays to the sort of issues of our time, and enabling this sort of opportunity to experience and encounter the V&A's collections in a new way. At the Collection and Research Centre, we have the gnarly task of moving 250,000 three-dimensional objects from our storage facility in West Kensington, which is very restricted access. We've been there for 35 years. And at the time that we entered into this project in the Olympic Park, the British government decided to sell the building in which we had been housed for decades. And this gave us a real opportunity. We could put it in a field in the countryside, quite cheap, no access, bus the curators there when they needed to get to their objects. Or we could take it somewhere else in the country, but we felt very much that this was an opportunity to bring the collection to the center of the Olympic Park project and really be ambitious about what we mean when we say we're a public institution, and explore the ways in which we can open up what we do. So we are a storehouse, but we're forging a new kind of typology, and we will talk about this a bit. We've got a brief that we've developed. We need to house and store in appropriate conditions everything from 500-year-old embroidery samplers to Frank Lloyd Wright's design for a total plywood interior for an office for Edgar Kaufman Jr., through to Syrian ancient shards of pottery, plastics that are grading at a rate of knots, and so on. But we also have thousands of archives of living designers, living working theatres, practitioners like Eileen Gray, companies that were pioneering photographic sort of reproduction technology with 3D objects in the 19th century. And then bring all of this to life with public experience, with studios and workshops, so we can teach from school age up to postdoc research fellows, galleries that enable us to show work and show ideas in progress in a much more informal way than we're able to do in a museum context. And then conservation and our loans program and the sort of work that we do behind the scenes is critical to that. So we set this brief that we wanted to, become this sort of integrated storehouse with galleries, with studios, classrooms, workshops, and laboratories, and expose all of these amazing activities that go on in most museums, any museum, but particularly at an extraordinary level and intensity at the V&A. And we also want to be able to focus on object-based learning and position ourselves as a space for kind of critical inquiry into the collection and enable many histories and many perspectives to come to the fore about historic objects, but also in relation to creative practice. This is just a picture of a recent resident, Lubna Chowdhury, who's a British-born ceramicist of Pakistani heritage, who's very interested in the sort of collision of ornamental decoration from her sort of homelands, if you like, and her entrenched sort of aesthetics of European modernism, and being able to create spaces for practitioners, for students, for everybody to make these kind of investigations is a defining feature of what we're trying to do. And then we need to think through new methodologies of engagement. Young people that we're talking to in our kind of scoping research in the immediate neighborhood are, you know, they want things through a different kind of mediated encounter, but they also say, don't assume that we want everything through a digital interface. We want to have direct haptic encounters with objects and multi-sensory sort of experiences. So this is a big kind of challenge for us, and how do we build in that infrastructure? And how do we create the magic of going behind the scenes of the museum? Because it is enchanting and entrancing for people to open a cabinet of 18th century shoes. I find it delightful. Others find their kind of interest elsewhere, but these opportunities to be able to activate, but also be transparent as an institution, to show work, to collaborate with people, to develop new forms of knowledge and expertise, is at the center of what we are doing. And this is what Liz has got to deal with, the shed. So that's me, I think. I think I covered everything.
Thanks, Catherine. Thank you for that presentation.
Okay, thank you.
So that was the brief, I guess.
That was the brief. You know, I actually don't remember it in as much detail, but you know, well, obviously it's evolved.
Sort of done some post-rationalizing, maybe.
But it was, you know, I always found the V&A to be like, you know, maybe the most exciting museum, you know, and it's not only are they adventurous in terms of the exhibitions and also commissioning architecture, but you know, this brief and this sort of thinking out loud, well, what, you know, we have to move all of our stuff from all these various storage spaces, you know, and there are some very practical reasons why there was a kind of timeline. They had to move out and into another place, and this here East afforded itself. So there was this opportunity to think about bringing all this stuff together in one place, and it has been a fantastic challenge. And you know, I want to say just, you know, this has nothing to do with the V&A's collection, but
well, we probably do have lots.
You probably have many more.
It's inevitable.
But you know, I think the very, very first thing that came to mind is collecting, right? And the storage of a collection. So different than my experience in making a museum or making displays. This is all of a sudden a very, very different task, and I guess one of the sort of, you know, most interesting aspects, and we have dealt with collections. The Broad Building was a private collection of post-war art. Obviously, MoMA, you know, is like fantastic collection of 20th century. They all had their logics, and the logics of collecting say something about the institution and the collector. You know, doesn't necessarily say. So, you know, so anyway, getting to collecting, just thinking about collecting and who's doing the collecting and why, you know, sort of raises the question of order, like what, you know, like, and what are the orders? And when we store things, you know, we put things in certain kind of orders, and we take them out of order when we exhibit things. So there's this sort of pre-curated order, which there is really beautiful. The curated is also interesting, but there's something else here in the collecting. And, you know, so one could look at a sort of a species of a certain type, and then look at, you know, hoarding and collecting. And I know this guy probably knows every little thing in his collection, you know, and where everything is. But it's so, you know, idiosyncratic, and this is just part of the sort of thinking of diving into this project. This quote by Walter Benjamin: "I'm unpacking my library, yes I am. The books are not yet on the shelves, not yet touched by the mild boredom of order." And I love this way of starting this, sort of thinking about, the status of your books when they're in boxes and before they go onto shelves. Like, how do you go from one thing to another? And this beautiful moment of the in-between before, there's a sort of classification. So anyway, this is where things sort of started. The site, as Catherine mentioned, is this existing building. It was built for the Olympics as a broadcast building. It's gigantic. And the V&A has a portion of it. I don't know what percent, 20% or maybe a little less.
No, the percentage, it's about 160, 70,000 square feet, something like that.
Yeah, something like
but
that.
But it's volumetrically, it's also...
And then we have multiple levels. There are 2 levels that are already built in, and then we're building some more levels. But it's a beautiful big warehouse of a building.
What's the legacy, the post-Olympic legacy? Was that always for the V&A, or did you have to bid for it? Because the London Olympics in 2012, part of the bid for London for the Olympics was that every building would have a legacy. So what was the relationship?
I think they concentrated at that time on legacy for the sporting infrastructure, making sure the swimming pool became a kind of,
right.
Olympic pool, but with local use. The stadium will maybe skip round the problems of the stadium, still functioning. West Ham Football Club now occupy that. And then I guess the broadcasting building, they would have been having conversations about that. But really at that time of the games and just immediately afterwards, the focus was on building new homes and turning the athletes' villages into homes and then putting in business infrastructure. So it wasn't until sort of after the games had happened that they sort of went, sort of cultural institutions and education could add something into this mix as well.
So in this building are a bunch of different kinds of programs. There are schools, there are design studios, there's Wayne McGregor's there. There are different kinds of things, startups, tech companies, and the V&A had the opportunity to take a huge chunk of space, and you just saw that interior that Catherine showed. The idea, there are several principles that I wanted to point out from the competition, because we were really sort of stirred up by the competition. There's so many things, 250,000 objects, 900 and something archives. There's just a lot of stuff. This building was made for broadcast. It wasn't really made for human occupation, for public. It was meant to send signals out. And now when you when you put stuff into it, when you pack it, what's the logic of packing this building and bringing the public in? So, so there are a couple of steps, kind of conceptual steps along the way. One is, there are more objects than there are space, and there's the V&A continues to collect. So how do we get everything in here? But let's just assume that we just pack it full of stuff. And then let's assume that we excavate parts of it almost as if it were a solid object to produce space for function for the public and other stuff. So it was kind of an idea about just this sort of, it is a warehouse. Ultimately, it is a warehouse, but how do you make it into something else? So this, if you imagine, this is the perimeter of the space. We have three of those sides are to the outside, to exterior. One is a shared sort of party wall with other tenants. But if you just, in this abstraction, this diagram really is a very key point. Because the building has really no windows around the periphery, it was made for broadcast, that it seemed like the wrong place for the public to be, around the edges. So we thought, let's put the public in the middle, in that chord space. And this is a little bit inverted to the thinking when you have something very dear to you that's very important, you come into the building, you put like precious things further and further away from where the public is. And so because this is sort of inside out, the public is in the middle, the sort of inaccessible objects are on the edge. They're basically on the outer edge. And they're dormant objects, or they're objects that are not ready to come out. But it's a kind of, the accessibility is from the center to this these concentric zones, to this semi-private zone, to this absolutely private zone where other stuff is happening there and deep storage is there. So that's the diagram. The other thing is this sort of sense of organization and how do you do it? There are so many collections. There are so many species of elements. Catherine just mentioned a couple of them, and they include fashion and textiles and furniture, theater and performance, painting, sculpture, ceramics, glass, design, architecture, digital stuff. There's so many different things. Inside of any of them, there are smaller and smaller classifications of things in terms of the design collections, the ceramics, the sculpture, and so forth. And so this cabinet of curiosities is sort of like a fetish thing of ours. And we were sort of interested in how this display could take place. And the idea of this center space, this chord space for the public, allowing the public to sort of see the sublimity of all the stuff, of somehow arriving in the very middle of the collection or the storage. So the store, which is the collection. This notion of an immersive cabinet of curiosities was the concept of the project, and the concentric rings are part of that. So this long section, the north-south section, takes you from the street at one end, at the left-hand edge, from a lobby area up to a stair that takes you up to the first level into that chord void space that's surrounded by walkways, that's surrounded by all the shelving and all of the storage that we have. Okay, the actual access is sort of attenuated that we did at the Broad or Petra. That's sort of like you don't exactly know what's there. It's very tempting, and as you come in, you see little hints of where you're going, and then you arrive at this very dense storage system of racks that continue in every direction. You're also standing on top of it, and you can see down into it. Above is a luminous surface that brings light into the middle of the space. This is from one of the walkways. As you go up, you see things, you come into contact with things at various degrees. There's at the surface, and as you go deeper in, this is a good topic of conversation, where you can go, where you can't go. But the collection is full of things that are really big and really small. And some of those really big things are pieces of architecture, like you're seeing the outside of the Altamira ceiling, which is, it's actually not the outside because the inside is the part that you want to see, and you'll see it in a second. But we're very interested in how it's held there. And seeing how the museum, how the institution brings it to you, like the behind-the-scenes stuff, is very, very important.
And that particular object has an interesting life on the back of it, as well as the sort of decorative surface.
Notes and notations.
Yeah. And these traces of lives of objects are something that we've been talking about a lot. How do we bring that to the fore? And the architectural solution is have these points of exposure so that it's not sort of embedded in and clean around the edges like you would in a museum, but it's just the truth of the object. And
backs of things are important, sides of things, undersides of things are important.
That's what conservators look at, right? They look at the details in the back, and they find the history there. Experience the object.
And the public, is like, we typically museums talk to the public in one direction, this way. But public's actually interested in, getting under the surface a little bit, and this is an opportunity to see more. And so, from the size of, this Altamira ceiling or the Kaufman office or, some of the larger architectural fragments, to thimbles, tiny little things, that are like, so there's a huge array of stuff. And here is a visualization of the Altamira ceiling looking up and across and over. And the sort of sense that you're surrounded by lots and lots of stuff is really important. It doesn't, like whether they're in the species, they're in the right club or not. This is interesting curatorial. These are early renderings. We thought we could totally open this room. We didn't know exactly what was, So there were things that we took some chances with. Inside of the dense storage, and the racking are locations where you can actually see conservation, where there are views. This is a special gallery for large rolled things like, stage, like backdrops and, all sorts of things and textiles. So there are some large spaces. There are spaces for learning, and there are carved out spaces for galleries for testing sort of how things go together. And, there's also this, that we made this visualization of, this void space can be used for many things, when it's not used for what, and I just have a couple of slides left. We're also very interested at the scale of the object, so not only the sort of configuration of the whole building, but, what happens there. So we, started with this notion of, we know there are going to be commercially available racks, and we're going to be using racking. So we thought, let's hack those racks, and the very, very first strategy, almost like before we started anything else, we just cut off the end. And just by cutting off the end, you see these objects in a very different way than you do when you have the corner supports. So, it's just a very minor thing. But then there's also this question of, you have the stuff all around you, and you have, this is before we had the tributaries that actually go into between the aisles and between the racks. But you can also maybe see digitally what you can't see physically. So maybe you can send a camera inside, or maybe you can send an X-ray someplace. We also fell in love when we went sort of back, into the stores that are already at the V&A. We start to find these like weird things that are actually more beautiful than what's underneath them. Like they're just draped and stored, and they have this sort of labels on them. And we started to, really take very seriously, like the storage is typically very often in crates. Sometimes it's uncrated, but sometimes it's just restrained. And, this is just like a box that's just restrained and we sort of love this idea of like playing with this in-between stage of being on display and having the crate just being open for you. So you're catching us in a kind of very vulnerable place because we're right in the middle of the work, which is kind of great because we're here to share our thoughts and ongoing discussions. But because there's so much untested stuff here, we just really don't know. The Boymans is going to open a little bit before, and they have a slightly different approach. Catherine knows more about that than I do. But we don't know how people are going to behave. There are all sorts of questions about between the conservation and curatorial about how to do this, which has been, I think, the single most interesting challenge of doing a project like this. So I'll just leave it at that. And, okay, so we could come back to how real.
I mean, we don't have a lot of time. And I think that just through this conversation that, the kind of richness of approaching this sort of new, almost like a new kind of museology of this like revealing and not necessarily curating. It's almost like a sort of post-curatorial, just show everything and then you interpret and you sort of leave so much up to the viewer or visitor to explore.
We're still wrangling with
what's
that.
The rank? Yeah, what's the rank? I'd love to just get that little window into those kind of conversations between the two of you about, what's share with us some of the conversations that you've had about like how do you decide what goes, to the general public or those sort of filtering processes?
There's the sort of poetry of discovery, as we call it, and how much can we enable serendipitous encounter and the sort of construction of connections between things that people will do with their own imaginations anyway. But there is also a need to impart knowledge, to make new knowledge together with different publics, and what we're really trying to resist is going straight to that kind of typical museum thing, and we'll slap a label on everything and give you the tombstone information, and we will have some of that, but we haven't quite. We're testing that at the moment because we don't want to alienate audiences either, who step in for one reason and then feel at sea because you can't assume that people have. Always have depth of prior knowledge, and there are lots of interesting stories that surface as a consequence of opening up the collection in this way and through the sort of unusual combinations of things in a less curated mode. But what Liz and the team have been doing, I suppose, is creating this kind of amazing infrastructure where you are able to then graft on and change and move things around. It's really a live place of work, and I don't just mean in terms of conservators or our loans program or curators coming to look at objects, but really a space of being able to give platforms to both the museum teams, but also others that come in and collaborate with us to present ideas and think through collections, and therefore our sort of shared design and material culture in a different way. And that might be in the form of a gallery, or it might be in the form of rearranging those objects. They will move a lot anyway, so I think it feels like it would be very dynamic. But it's enabling these sort of polyphony of voices to come through, which I think is really what is transformational. And the behaviours question is an interesting one, because you always get the instant reaction of, oh God, everybody will be touching everything, and that's natural for people whose job it is to care for things and preserve them in perpetuity. But actually, I think people are. This is a different mode, and it will be quite a sort of a special space where the rules of engagement will be different, and we can break those rules, and we are breaking the rules, because really everything should just be in the dark and nobody should be able to have a look at it. But so it is about sort of testing these ideas and how to break the rules, but effectively.
I just want to follow up on that, because it's really, really the core of the issue, because there are so many museums that are interested in opening up their storage, and I think that there's a shift in sort of public interest and consciousness and realization that there's so much behind the scenes, and usually it's like a small percentage of stuff that actually gets on display and it's curated and these stories are being told to you. So this is a kind of phenomenon, and we're at the early part of the phenomenon. But what's so interesting for us doing this together, really for the first time, struggling with the issues of the conservators. The conservators, they're exactly, precisely, their job is to put the stuff in a dark space, in the perfect conditioned environment, away from the public, totally safe. It's not that they want to do that, but that's the best way of conserving the stuff. And so their job is to conserve the stuff in perpetuity, as Catherine said. The objective of a project like this is to do the opposite, is to put the stuff as close to the public as is humanly possible. But this is where the judgment and the risk is, and the design and the give and take, is what gets closest to the public. How far can the public actually walk, go in? How much can they see? At what viewing distance? How much is exposed? How much can they actually touch unassisted or assisted? And it turns out that there are certain strategies and rules, like the amount of light, the robustness of objects, the scale of objects, the materials from which they're made. Some are more vulnerable, obviously, than others. And there are certain kinds of logics that come to bear on the organization of the stuff. And that's, it will have its own logic when it opens. And it won't be, obviously, like a representation of every single thing will be out there at the outermost layer. But, it's kind of this really interesting intersection between curatorial and conservation and design, where this new thing lives.
Yeah, I mean, this project is enabling us to put on display a 3-story section of Robin Hood Gardens that we acquired a couple of years ago at the point of demolition.
Yeah.
A very important piece of public housing, not very far away from the Olympic Park. It could go into South Kensington, but that would involve the demolition of historic galleries, and actually it feels right that it comes to East London and is then the subject of a long-term, research project where we hear from people who live there, lived experience, as well as architectural historians. Or we commissioned Doho Su to make a film while Robin Hood Gardens was being demolished, and we'll be able to, thanks to Liz's and her team's kind of inventive approach to the spatial experience and the way that we can embed these objects within the design, we'll be able to show that in situ through as you're in the building, as it were. So there are magical opportunities. The cloth that you were looking at is a stage cloth designed by Natalia Goncharova for a Ballet Russe production that was made in London in the 1930s. And we can't show that on any of the V&A sites. We have to lend that object to see that object and to conserve that object. And so in this space, it's really boringly at the moment, because this is where we're at, nothing has been named. It is the Large Rolled Objects Gallery. But other large rolled objects that we have include one-to-one paintings of the ornamental facade work of buildings in Iran that were made in the 19th century that we have not, been looking at for a long time. So it's a catalyst for all of this inquiry to come.
So we will, could talk about this forever, and thank you so much for sharing so much with us of this amazing project, and we'll be there in 2023, if not later. But thank you. Could everyone join me in thanking Liz and Catherine for this?